Well, it's time to kick off Season 3 of GSA Does That. I'm your host, Rob Trubia, and in this, our first episode of our third season, we'd like to take some time to reflect a little on our first two seasons and set the stage for season number 3. My guest today is our producer, Mr. Max Stempora. Max, my friend, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Rob. I am excited to be on with you and talking Season 3 of GSA Does That.
Yeah, this is going to be a lot of fun. I think it's pretty neat that you're a guest. You don't typically function in this role. I don't think you ever have, actually. So I'm excited. I'm excited you're here, and I'm excited to ask you some questions.
Yeah, I can't wait.
Well, let's start off pretty simply. Not everybody knows the answer to this one, but I'd like to know, and I'd like our listeners to know a little bit more about how the idea for GSA Does That came about, and just what type of podcast is GSA Does That?
Sure. I think that's a great place to start for anybody who's new. Maybe you've only tuned into one episode, maybe two. This whole podcast, you might be asking yourself, what is this? Why should I be listening? And the goal with GSA Does That, and what we're really trying to do, is to tell the stories about the people and programs. And with a podcast, I think it allows us to tell those stories a little bit more fully, if you will, when you compare it to, say, a blog or a social media post, where you're really limited in the amount of text you can do. So with the podcast, and a great host, the conversation can kind of go on and, touch on a bunch of different things. So GSA Does That, again, people behind the scenes making government work. That's really what we're doing here.
Well, I appreciate that answer. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about some of your favorite episodes, maybe even a couple that for you really hit the mark when it comes to this is what GSA Does That is all about.
Sure. That's a really hard question for me, right? Because there's little bits in every episode that I like. The first one that comes to mind is a two-parter, so maybe that's a little bit cheaty. But it was our only two-parter that we've done, and it was about the sale of lighthouses. And I think what is great about that episode is, like I said, it's a two-parter. And the first one, we're learning about how the Coast Guard sort of selects which lighthouses are going to be decommissioned. And then we learn about GSA's role in the process and what we do to help the Coast Guard. And then in the second episode, we dive into what it's like when somebody actually buys a lighthouse. And you would think, I put a bid on a lighthouse. It's pretty straightforward. You get a lighthouse, boom, it's yours. But that episode really unraveled a lot of the details, right? Like, I remember the person we talked to telling us about, having appliances delivered via barge and having a crane to pull them out and get them, delivered. Like, it was a process. But what came through that entire episode and that conversation with her was just the love she had. And I think if you were to ask her, would you do it again? The answer was absolutely yes. So that's probably my favorite one right off the bat. I would throw it to you, as I'm talking about learning new things and what I'm getting out of it. Rob, you started at GSA 2 years ago, pretty much a month before the podcast started to air. What have you learned? What's been surprising to you that you didn't know, or, you're fascinated to find out about every episode?
I learned that the name General Services Administration is incredibly fitting because it really is so general. And I don't want people to think that general means boring or anything like that. It's not that. It's just that it's vast and it's deep. I mean, GSA touches so many things. I mean, people that know anything about GSA automatically go to, IT, contracts, real estate, cars and trucks, all very true. And we have a tremendous staff and tremendous people that work that type of thing each and every day. But I think at its core, and what has been interesting to learn, is that GSA is really technology centric. It's really about making sure technology works for the American people. And I've learned about that, and I've just met so many fascinating people, they're just interesting. They're from all over the country, a lot of great backgrounds, and it's just been fun to get to know them and know their part. And the thing that I also learned is that I absolutely love working for GSA. I mean, one of my favorite episodes was we're just talking about how we just landed as the number 2 best agency for medium-sized agencies to work in the federal government. And, as the last 2 years have unfolded, I could see why that is, because when we talk to folks, they are really genuinely excited about working for GSA each and every day. And they really believe in what they do. Very much public servants at heart. And I think that's really just been a lot of fun. So yeah, a lot of good things that I've learned. It's been fascinating. And to know that we sell lighthouses is also, pretty incredible. It's one of my favorite things to tell people. I'm curious, Max, do you feel like the podcast is resonating with our audience? It seems like we've gotten a very good foothold very quickly with this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what a little bit of what you just touched on and kind of what I was saying, GSA does so much stuff, right? I mean, it's a wide variety of things we do. So I think our listeners kind of enjoy that, right? They get to tune in, and it's not just learning about acquisition, right? It's not just learning about buildings, right? Every episode, it's something different, right? And we're talking to not just people inside GSA, we're talking to people from across government, across the private sector, right? So listeners aren't just getting a podcast based on one thing. They're getting a ton of different information week to week, episode to episode. And I think that's what people really enjoy, right? It's not just the engaging conversation. It's the fact that they're learning something new every week. So yeah, I think it definitely resonates. And hopefully season 3, we can keep building on that.
Podcasting itself is, it's exploded. It is a bit of a unique medium, but it's certainly common now. Like, it's out there, like everyone's podcasting. And I'm curious, Max, how, in your opinion, do you feel like podcasting is really effective communication tool? And I'm wondering, particularly for government agencies like ours.
Yeah, so I think podcasting is a great tool, right? And this is what we do day to day. So maybe I'm a little bit biased, but when I look at the benefits of a podcast, right, they are typically longer form, right? So it allows for a more in-depth conversation. So it's not just 500 words on a blog or 240 characters in a social media post. You can actually dive into the weeds of something, right? And really explain why it's beneficial to the listener, what's it going to do for the country. And it's not just that surface level information, right? You can really have that back and forth conversation. And I think that's another thing that makes it great about a podcast and having a host where, if the guest says something, we can dive down that rabbit hole. We can dig a little bit deeper, right? And go a little bit off script and make the conversation that much more engaging. So yeah, I think that's the benefit of a podcast for government. It's not just the high level points, more in the weeds, more details that really make it a benefit.
Well, switching gears a little bit to looking ahead to season 3, Max. I'm curious, certainly, I'm curious as your host, is there anything in particular that you're looking forward to, that you're hoping to get on the show, whether it might be a particular person or maybe just a mission from GSA?
Sure. So it's interesting. Before we started taping this morning, I went back and sort of looked at the numbers a little bit and looked at what we've done, right? It's been 2 seasons. We've done 32 episodes. We've had on over 52 guests, right, across those episodes. So we've touched on a lot of different topics, but I had no issue when I started brainstorming season 3, like finding topics we could continue to talk about and things we haven't touched on. One of the ones that comes to my mind, like right off the bat, is the art and architecture program. And for those listeners who don't know, GSA sets aside a certain small percentage of every new major renovation or construction project for art and public spaces. Tried to do some research this morning, how many pieces is it? How many buildings, right? I couldn't find a definitive answer. So it'd be really cool to have the program in, learn more about the process and even learn, as a citizen, how do I see these, right? Is there a place I can go? Is there a website so I can browse? I'd like to learn more about that. And another one that I'm really interested about having on, and I think a lot of people may not realize this, GSA plays a role in movies, right? So if a federal building is in movies, how does that happen, right? And that's a part of and function of GSA. So I want to learn more about that. And I think that would be a really interesting topic. I guess, Rob, I'd be curious as a host, and again, you've been talking to people throughout the year. Is there anything that you've heard you're like, Max, make sure you get this on the schedule?
The two that you mentioned, I am actually genuinely excited about the, GSA in the movies, if we want to call it that, the art and architecture program for sure. I think as a, member of the Air National Guard and a long career with the Air Force, aviation is near and dear to my heart. And I think I would love to see us talk about GSA aviation, which I had no idea existed, but
Yeah.
I don't even know hardly anything about it. But I know GSA has some role in federal aviation. So that certainly would be one I'd be interested in.
Yeah. And I'll spoiler alert, that's on the schedule for early in this season. So you're going to get your wish.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you said you have no problem coming up with new topics, because I really enjoy doing this, and it's fun to think that we've got lots of stuff to explore. It's so cool when you say, Rob, here's what we're doing. We're going to talk about, GSA in the movies, and then it's my job to go research that, learn about it, just get smart about it for a little bit, and then smart enough to be able to at least ask some questions that people might be curious about as well. So it's a pretty neat opportunity to just constantly be learning about new things. And there's not another agency I'd rather be doing this for, simply because it's so vast and there's so much opportunity. Max, before we wrap up, I'm curious if you could just share a little bit more about how folks would maybe get in touch with us, learn a little bit more about the podcast, and maybe just even a little bit more about GSA.
So, Rob, there are definitely a couple ways. We're always looking for feedback. We're always looking for episode ideas. So I would point people to first, to learn more about the podcast, go to gsa.gov/podcast, right? All of our episodes in the back catalog are there. You can also, send us an email at gsa@gsa.gov if you have an episode idea, or you just want to provide feedback on, why aren't you doing this? Or can you, maybe talk to these people, right? We love hearing from you. And even social media, right? On all the major social media platforms, we're constantly posting segments from the podcast, images, quotes, things like that. So go in, find us on social media. You can leave a comment and we'll see it and definitely get back in touch with you. But yeah, those are the three ways, web, social, or sending us an email.
Great. No, I appreciate you sharing that. And we really do want everyone, of course, we want you to subscribe and listen, but we really would love to hear from you. We do hear once in a while. We'd like to hear more often. We'd love those emails, and we'd love those just comments on the show. So that would be great. Well, Max, I think this has been a ton of fun for me. I hope you've enjoyed it. I think it's going to be a great season 3. So here's to 2025 and hopefully our best season ever. GSA Does That is a production of the U.S. General Services Administration, Office of Strategic Communication. Thanks for listening.